Cool. So the title of this webinar is Understanding the Status Quo. The reason for that is this whole series is really focused on beginning to understand problems. If you're an aspiring entrepreneur or you want to apply entrepreneurial theory to, what you do on a regular basis, your job, your everyday life, one of the very critical frameworks is problem identification, or processes rather. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking a lot about that process. Over the course of this quarter, we're going to be talking about different aspects of understanding a problem, identifying competitors, and a lot of other things. And all of this is in preparation for Startup Week, which is a business competition that's going to be May 25th to 29th, and it's online. So if you're interested, please stay tuned in the coming weeks. We're going to be having more information coming out. Yeah, so get some friends together and compete. So who am I? Why am I talking to you? Why am I qualified? I feel it's important to address those things. So I've never worked for a startup necessarily or started one, but I do have some entrepreneurial experience. I started the undergraduate satellite program at UC Davis. There's a lot of organizational growth and development involved with that, a lot of working with government officials, fulfillment, things like that. I am doing the technology management minor, which I'm sure there's probably a few people here that are also doing that. So it's a lot of business involved in that. I am the business development manager, student manager at the Startup Center. So I'm one of the ones that focuses really heavily on, verifying and validating potential startups on their business merits. And a little fun fact, I spent this past summer in Germany, study abroad trip. So that picture is of, so I'm standing in Germany in that picture, but the background is actually Belgium because it was so close to the border, which I thought was really cool. So enough about me, what are we actually going to be talking about? So the first thing that we're going to be addressing is what is the status quo within your problem area, and I'll be defining what a problem area is. Within that area, how do people deal with their issues right now, and why does that suck? Why is that not optimal? That's one of the questions that you should always be asking whenever you first start your sort of entrepreneurial journey. And what is the job that your potential customers want done? So sometimes it's difficult to frame what you're working on in the context of a problem. If I want to start a new coffee company, I'm not necessarily solving a problem, but I'm fulfilling a job. People need coffee. There's other things out there that they can get their coffee from, but I'm trying to do that job better. So it's another way of looking at why you're in business. Kind of a general comment. If you ever have questions, please just unmute yourself. Feel free to interrupt me and ask away. I'll try to give several opportunities for that. So what is a problem area? It's kind of better to think about it as more of an interest area, because it's really whatever facet of business you're interested in. So, if you're a bio person, maybe you're into ag. If you're into finance, maybe you're into fintech. My thing is new space, which is the sort of the name given to space startups. So you probably already have one in mind if you're, on this call or interested in entrepreneurship. But if you're not, I really encourage you to reach out to people, meet people, and figure out, what that might look like for you. Now, something like ag tech or new space is pretty general. And so what you're going to want to do is get more specific. New space is a big industry. There's a lot of different facets within that. So, maybe I'm interested in commercializing access to space or whatever. Maybe I want to get even more specific and talk about, communication, basically like internet providers. So you can always get more specific with your problem area, with your interest area, and I definitely encourage you to do so, because often when you start with a big problem, you spend too much time figuring out what it is you're actually doing. So another question that you should ask yourself whenever you first kind of identify what it is you want to work on is it legitimate? So the example I give here is maybe you're interested in stabilizing platypus population in Eastern Florida, but does anybody care? And that's meant to be weird. That's meant to be really obscure. I think a lot of us, especially college-age students, you know, we have our interests. We're nerds about certain things, but it's very important to kind of give yourself a reality check very early on and ask yourself, is there a market? And a good way of finding out whether there is one or not is to talk to potential customers about their issues and how they deal with them. You know, maybe there are some farmers in Eastern Florida that there's just way too much platypi on their property and they need to get rid of them. So, okay, maybe it is a problem. Maybe I do want to pursue this. But you always want to make sure that what you're pursuing is legitimate at the outset, because it's always unfortunate to be working on something for a few months only to find out that there's nobody there to be paying for it. Are there any questions so far? Cool. All right, so with that, how do you figure out if it's legit? How do you learn the market? So there's, in my mind, two ways to do this, and you should definitely do both. The first is interviews. You're going to want to talk to not just potential customers, but people involved in your problem area. You know, if I'm talking about, let's see, if I want to fix the infrastructure in Sacramento County, you know, I'm not just going to talk about the people who use it on a day-to-day basis. I'm not just going to talk to the residents of Sacramento or wherever else. But I'm also going to talk to maybe the government officials who fund that and subsidize that. Maybe I'm going to talk to people who work at SMUD, the company that runs a lot of the infrastructure in Sacramento. And whenever you do these interviews, you should often try to target them at the motivations. You know, why do people do what they do, especially when you're talking to consumers. And the reason why you want to do that is talking about motivations, talking about the reasons why people do things often helps you develop a more comprehensive understanding of a problem area. You know, the goal of learning a market is kind of self-contained. The goal of learning is to learn, it's to know things. When you're about to go to an investor or to a potential co-founder, you want to seem like the expert. You want to seem like you know all the things. And so when you talk about not just, hey, what problems do you have? Which is obviously a question you should ask, but also, you know, how does that make you feel? Or what are you doing about it? Those sorts of questions can often lead to a better understanding, a more comprehensive understanding of a market. And then the second thing that I highly recommend is observations, data collection. So it's not enough to get a bunch of anecdotes. You know, there's this gag or there's this running joke that, you know, if you're pitching a startup, everybody talks about, oh, Sally from accounting has this issue and that's why we're doing this. And that's nice. But a company that can grow, that can scale, has to have more than just one customer. And so by observing trends, by taking data, you're able to connect that anecdote about Sally or whoever else to, you know, trends in the momentum of the market. And that's really important when you're trying to, again, validate your efforts in your company. So I'll give you an example. I don't remember the name of this person, but a professor at Harvard Business School. This is a story that, if you're familiar with Aaron Anderson, one of the directors at the Startup Center, he tells a lot. He was tasked with figuring out why people, or how to improve the sale of milkshakes at a particular chain. And one of the things that he did was whenever somebody would go up to buy a milkshake, he would simply ask them, why are you buying this milkshake? It's a very simple question, and he got several different answers, but they began to kind of form a trend. Often in the morning, people were getting a milkshake because that was their breakfast. So you kind of learn a motivation. You learn the job that they want to be done. But later on, maybe around 3 or 4 p.m., people are buying milkshakes for their kids because they just want them to be happy on the way from school to home. So interviews can kind of help you learn the motivations. But he didn't just interview people. He didn't just talk to people. He took tallies. So he actually figured out when were the peak sales times. And so the peak sales times were, of course, those early morning crowds trying to get to work and the after school crowds trying to quiet their kids. So I guess what I'm trying to say is interviews and observations are very important when verifying and validating the market early on. Are there any questions so far? Cool. I guess I'm just great at explaining things. That's a joke. Now what? So knowledge alone, in my opinion, is not power. That's kind of a trope that's portrayed in a lot of movies. But in my opinion, it's not true. But it is a tool. So what should you do with it? One of the things that I like to do, because I'm kind of technically driven, but I'm also because I'm visually driven, is I like to arrange a lot of this information in a systems diagram. Now, when we're talking about systems, that's anything from, my process for doing the dishes, which is an example we'll talk about later, to something as complicated as how a business acquires materials and turns that into products. So systems diagrams you can use for things that are very simple and things that are quite complex. And so as an engineer, one of the things that I was taught to do is to not just look at how things are, but the idealized version. Because you should always kind of push towards that idealized version with the understanding that you're not always going to be able to get there. So in an idealized systems diagram, there are no problems. All processes are perfectly efficient, and they're really just meant to set the benchmark for perfection. What is in a perfect world? How does this look like? And once you kind of talk about that, once you think about that, it's good to talk about real world. What are some of the issues that as you've talked to your potential customers, as you've taken data on, how these customers or how many there are and how much money they're losing and all of these things that are specific to your problem area. How do those issues play into your diagram? What are the inefficiencies in the different processes? What are they? And that's kind of meant to show where you should focus your efforts. And this is pretty abstract right now, and I apologize, but I will promise to make it more concrete in a moment. So each system diagrams really, if you want to keep it very simple, contains 3 components. There are drivers. So talking about those motivations earlier, drivers are what incentivize and catalyze processes. What is pushing you to do what you do. Processes, pretty self-explanatory. It's what you do, what things make happen. And then the IO, inputs, outputs, are things like time, effort, money, goods, services, more money for outputs. Yeah. So are there any questions on that? And please feel free to shout out. All righty. Cool. So this is an example of a systems diagram. It's a pretty simple one. It's for cleaning the dishes. So, say I really want to have my driver, my initial one. Hopefully you can see my mouse. Is a desire for a clean kitchen. I'm house sitting for my mom right now, and because she's house hunting in Arizona, which really doesn't make any sense given current events. But when she comes back, I want her to, have a clean kitchen because I want to be a good son or whatever. So that's my motivation. It's one of them. Another driver is just the everyday use of my dishes. I cook, I eat, I use plates, I use pans, I use all of these things. And so there's processes in a separate system, which we're not going to be talking about because it's not really relevant, that kind of provide the material need for some sort of process. So with my motivation, with my desire for a clean kitchen, that leads me to engage in the process of preparing the sink. So what I do when I do the dishes is I fill the sink with water and soap so that I have like a tub. And so the output of that is a prepped sink. Cool, awesome. Now, with the driver of the use of dishes, I have dirty dishes. It's another input, awesome. So with my prep sink and my dirty dishes, I'm able to scrub, rinse, dry, and store my dishes. Some output of that is now I have a dirty sink. Well, that sucks. I want a clean kitchen, so I'm probably gonna have to clean that later. And as you can see, we have another process of cleaning and drying the sink. And the output of that is a clean sink. And the output of cleaning the dishes is clean dishes in their place. Cool. So that's just a super simple, literally the simplest thing I could think of diagram. And that's ideal. So what does that look like in a non-ideal case, in a real case, when I'm, lazy, like right now there's a bunch of dishes piled up, when I don't feel like doing anything? What does that look like? It's a lot simpler. Maybe I'm not so motivated. My mom's not coming back for a couple of days, so I don't need to worry about it right now. But I still use dishes every day. So I still make dirty dishes. So I still have to scrub, rinse, dry, and store them. So I get it's incomplete, I guess I typo, oops. That should be a dirty sink. And now I have, clean dishes drying in the rack. So the goal of this exercise, it seems like a lot of work, and especially when you try to put it in a slide deck, it's just like there's lines and boxes and stuff. But the goal of this is to identify, what are the things preventing me from having an idealized system? So I want to get some feedback because I have been talking this entire time. What do people think? And feel free to shout out. What are the key differences, the things that need to be improved between these two diagrams?
I would think that like in an idealized world, the process looks much simpler, whereas in the real world, there are a lot of other factors that come into play.
Okay.
Yeah.
So things that I didn't necessarily consider in this diagram.
I'm gonna have to look back at the previous one.
Sorry about that. So this is the ideal version. It's a bit more complex.
Right, like things like the process is missing, right?
Yeah.
Preparing the sink.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's some missing processes.
Right.
What else? Does anybody else have some input?
I noticed that the real situation is that it's a lot less thorough because then it's not like as close to the kind of perfection.
Definitely. Anyone else? Cool. So you two hit on really good points, accurate points. There are some processes that are missing. There are some details that are missing. Maybe my model isn't that realistic, especially for another person. I don't necessarily know anybody that does dishes the same way that I do, except for my mom, because she showed me. One thing that is important to identify in a systems diagram, and one of the reasons why they're really useful, is the highlight dependencies. So, why was that process not there? In this actual case, I only have one process, but in the previous one, I have three. Well, why is that? Well, if we look at, why, why we have two of these processes and why they're gone in the real case is because they're related to a driver. They're dependent on the desire for a clean kitchen. If I'm doing things the right way, if I have that motivation, I'm going to engage in the pre-process of preparing the sink. And if I have that motivation, I'm going to engage in the post-process of cleaning the sink after I'm done. But without that driver, which is kind of as I was saying before, it's the reason why we do a lot of the things we do in this case, we lose out on some of those processes. We lose out on some of those details. And so if you ever use this tool, which I do recommend, especially if you're dealing with something that's like complicated and there's a lot of moving parts and interdependencies, if you ever use this, I definitely recommend looking at, what are the items, what are the drivers, the processes, the inputs that if you took them out, what would happen? Would the system collapse? Would it just become less efficient? That's kind of one of the useful tools behind this. So, what's the problem? So, like Nima and Parth identified, the absence of the processes is one of the biggest issues, and maybe it's also the drivers. But perhaps this isn't the actual problem. So one of the issues with building models is, we're imperfect beings. We don't necessarily have a perfect understanding of what's going on. So maybe, or most certainly, I can't use this diagram as evidence to an investor that this is the problem that the market's facing. This is what we need to be investing in. This is what we need to be working on. It's not the sole source of evidence, I should say, but it is a good indication of where to look. It's a good indication of how to move forward. Does that make sense? Yeah, Parth?
So is the systems diagram a way to just format your business idea to see its scope in the real world?
Yeah, so you can use system diagrams on basically anything. In this context, I'm kind of using it on something that happens in the world with maybe, I don't know, I'm making a product to make cleaning your dishes easier or whatever. So I'm doing this diagram, using this framework, and I'm applying it to a potential customer. But you can and should also apply it to your internal processes, your own business. What are the drivers, processes, inputs, and outputs of your company? In an idealized version of your company, what would those be? And maybe you can use it as a tool to say, how do I get there? What's the work that I need to do in order to establish those processes, to establish those drivers, to acquire those inputs? Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. Let me make sure. Awesome. Just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Wow, that was actually really fast. A summary. I'm gonna ask you a bunch of questions afterwards because that was pretty short. So with the information discussed in this seminar, you should be able to identify a problem area that's niche enough to be investigated. I didn't talk too much about that process, but I trust that you're all smart enough people to figure out what you're really interested in, or to ask around and to discover something. you should be able to investigate that problem area, or at least know what that process looks like. Collecting information, interviewing people, and beginning to piece that information together. Using that, hopefully you should be able to preliminarily validate the market surrounding your problem area. And I see preliminarily, I think I said that correctly. Sorry, bad with words. Preliminarily because, you know, when you're starting out, everything is pretty abstract. It's very theoretical. So it's important to verify those things once you have a product, once you have an MVP. You know, with all of that, you should be able to assemble those observed trends into a kind of a coherent model of your problem. So that was the systems diagram, and then use that model to identify key aspects of the system to be improved, removed, or introduced. So yes, and then next week, we're going to be discussing further validation of the legitimacy of your market. So using, you know, real information, real pieces of evidence, discussing external factors that might affect your success, talking about entrenched players, power structures, things like that, and a bunch more. So thank you all for coming. Does anyone have any questions to start off? Cool. By either like a show of hands or feel free to shout out, has what I have said today made sense? Thank you, Nima. Cool. I got one thumbs up. I assume everyone else is either indifferent or didn't understand what I was talking about. Any thoughts? All right, quick question. Who here is from Aaron's class?
I'm sorry, Dom, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Could you, or you can ask your question, but I was just wondering if you might walk us through an example of how this might apply to finding a problem that you might solve for a business. So getting to a business idea.
Yeah, of course. So it's always good to start with your problem area. Does anyone have just like an interest area? You know, what's their kind of their shtick? Feel free to just throw it out. All right, Fernando, what are you interested in? No response. Okay. All right, I will pick a.
Do you see the chat? Look at the chat.
I do not. Oh, okay, no mic.
Exploration and medical devices.
Thank you very much. I now do see the chat. Sorry, I'm not used to running the conference calls. Cool, medical devices. So you've already kind of narrowed it down for me, which is great. So let's narrow it down. Well, let's say we're beginning the process and we're interested in the world of medicine in general. You know, we want to make a difference. Maybe we don't necessarily want to be a doctor, but we want to work in that industry. And so maybe you're hardware focused. Maybe you like to work with your hands. And so that leads you down the path of, you know, well, maybe I should work with medical devices. There are all sorts of different devices within that industry. You know, you have prosthetics, you have respiratory machines, which is kind of a big thing right now. You have tools that are used by nurses and doctors and all of that. So there's a lot of different segments within that market. And so what you might do is begin by, you know, hopefully you know a person or two within the industry. And so by talking to them and introducing yourself to that market, you'll be able to begin to identify some players within the industry. Maybe not necessarily CEOs, but people who work there, who understand the issues that they face. So let's say that you've spent a couple of weeks just talking to colleagues, making warm introductions, and you figured out that the area that needs to be addressed right now is ventilators. That's pretty, topical at the moment. So let me go through. So at that point, you've identified your problem area. You wanna look at respiratory devices. So in order to make sure that that market is legit, like I said before, conducting interviews and collecting data is a good way of doing that. When you're looking at a very well-established market, a really good way of legitimizing it to yourself is, how much money is getting poured into this? What's the revenue that existing companies who make these devices pull in? And so if those figures are large enough, if they exist at all, really, that might legitimize your market. And so you've already begun this process of learning the market, introducing yourself, kind of beginning to establish yourself as someone who knows what they're talking about, or at least knows when they don't know. Being understanding of your own kind of intellectual journey, if you will. So you've learned the market. You've kind of identified what it is that you want to do. So you begin to think about what is the sort of the status quo. It's hard to get specific because I don't actually know too much about medical devices, but maybe you've identified, problem XYZ. And you've collected all this information. And so now you arrange it in your systems diagram. Maybe your drivers are, one of them is definitely going to be the desire for profit. So any business is a business that tries to make money. That's kind of a given. But another driver that kind of pushes people into particular businesses is, what they want to do with their lives. So with the medical industry, it's people who want to make a difference, people who want to help other people. So that's another driver. Maybe some of the processes, or definitely some of the processes involved are material acquisition, supply chain management. Other processes might be converting those materials into finished goods or marketing those things. Maybe the process you want to look at is R&D, and all of those have their respective inputs and outputs, the money you have to put in, the materials or the IP that you get out. And so by learning your industry, you can kind of put that together. And so you can assemble these idealized and these actualized systems diagram. And what I would do, if I was starting a business, is I would identify one of the inefficiencies or the processes which just don't exist, maybe even the drivers which don't exist. And I would focus my efforts on changing that, on increasing efficiency, which is always a really good way of pitching a company. It's always quite compelling to potential investors that need to say, hey, there's this $10 billion industry and they're wasting, 5% of that every year due to this inefficiency, which you've identified because you've collected that information and you put it in this diagram. And you want to focus your business around fixing that. So one of the issues with this process, as I'm sure you've noticed, is that it's very easy to get abstract. So I do apologize for that. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions?
Do you give an example of a systems diagram in context of space exploration, for example?
Sure. So I can't show you visually because they kind of take a little bit of time to draw, and I don't want to figure out technology. But let's think about by far the biggest producer of revenue in space is communications. When you call your friend across the state, or you call your relative across the globe, you're essentially sending a signal out into either to a tower nearby or even to space. And that gets relayed through a bunch of satellites and it gets pinged back down. And this is one of the really big emerging markets because the latency time in space is a lot lower than if you communicated via fiber optic cable. It's a pretty small difference, but in some industries, it's very important. For example, in the stock market, a difference of 1 microsecond seems like something so incredibly small, and we talking on the phone don't care about that, but that might mean the difference between a couple $1,000s when you're buying and selling stocks. So one of the drivers, aside from the desire to create revenue, is the desire to improve communications. So some processes involved with that might be research and development of improved satellite technologies. So I don't want to get too technical, but there's a lot of different subsystems in a satellite that can increase lifespan, that can make it faster, can make it safer. It's very difficult to keep a satellite alive in space. So there's a lot of different technologies in testing that goes into that. So these are a lot of the processes involved. And then, of course, outside of R&D, you have the typical things, acquiring materials, turning them into products, assembling them. And then, of course, you have, launching them. So that's kind of a whole other sector of the space industry. So if we want to talk about something even smaller, because again, that's kind of broad. If we want to talk about something even smaller, just talk about a single satellite, orbiting in space. Some of the processes that it does is collect information. So, I send up a text and it shoots up into space, and then a satellite collects it. It might do some stuff to that information, analyze it, or make sure that it got it in one piece. And then another process might be it'll send it back down. And then, it goes somewhere. So each one of those processes has their inputs and their outputs, and ultimately their driver, the reason why they exist, is because we want to effectively relay information. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So a good business or a good business idea should necessarily have a driver, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you should always have a reason for doing what you're doing. Maybe the only reason you're in business is to make money. That's fine. Cool. Go for it. But it's important to understand and identify what those are so that you can understand how that affects things.
Right.
It's one of those things that's hard to give a very concrete example unless you're like doing a case study on something.
I see.
Yeah. So if you're interested in getting a more kind of concrete example, the best way is always to go through the process. So some coursework, Management 120 is a really good one. And then of course, the Startup Week competition at the end of the quarter is another good one where we're going to be looking at, you know, your understanding of the problem area.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any final questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for showing up digitally and paying attention. I greatly appreciate, yeah, you being here. Thank you.